Hello, I'm Pat McGuinn from Drew University, and I'm here with Dr. Rachel Wise from the State Board of Education from the great state of Nebraska. And we are here today to talk about the Every Student Succeeds Act and state plans in preparation for that. So Dr. Wise, I wondered if you could start out by talking a little bit about, in your view, what are the most exciting opportunities, the most exciting new flexibility that ESSA provides for states?
Well, thank you, Pat. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you about Every Student Succeeds Act and the things that are happening in Nebraska. I believe the most exciting element about ESSA is the change that puts responsibility back to states. And Nebraska has been a state that has oftentimes, we do things our way. And so we are excited about being able to build on some of the momentum of activities already happening in Nebraska. And we think ESSA dovetails nicely in that process. When we start to look at the opportunities to build our accountability system that we've already been doing and align that with the needs of students and families and communities in Nebraska, we believe that's a great opportunity. We believe the opportunity to start to look at equity from a perspective of how do we meet the needs of all students, looking at a process that's more than test scores is important for Nebraskans.
Terrific. And you mentioned in Nebraska you like to do things your way. Can you talk a little bit about what the Nebraska Way is and what are the features of Nebraska that lead you to approach education a little differently, perhaps?
Nebraska has been forging its own path pretty much through No Child Left Behind, and will continue to do so with ESSA in the sense that we really engage stakeholders across Nebraska before we make decisions. We try to have a balanced process between local control and state control. In the things that we do in Nebraska, we've done that with assessment, and we've done that with building our new accountability system. And so we were a state that was not a waiver state. And so from that perspective, there were certain things in No Child Left Behind that we as Nebraskans just did not support and did not agree with. And I believe that our transition to ESSA gives us the opportunity to build on the momentum in Nebraska to look at accountability in a manner that we believe is important for our schools and our communities, and look at it in context of how do we provide intervention and support for those schools that are most in need of help and support in Nebraska.
Thank you. And you mentioned some of the features of No Child Left Behind that the state took issue with. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly. I think No Child Left Behind really narrowed education from my perspective, not just as a state board member, but as a retired educator. I believe that No Child Left Behind took education for about a 15-year period down to a narrow pathway. And in doing that narrow pathway, I'm not sure we really had the robust changes that we needed to improve student achievement. I believe that we focused so much on one particular component of assessment, and that would be a summative test score, and tried to make a lot of decisions about the needs of students and schools based on a test score. And education needs to be well-rounded, and I think ESSA starts to move us back in that direction.
Great, and I know you mentioned earlier that you're very much still in the developmental stage of your state plan in Nebraska for ESSA. What do you think are some of the most innovative or distinctive features of your state's particular approach to ESSA? What they might be, where you might differ from other states in how you approach this?
Well, I think two elements that are unique to Nebraska is how we have developed an accountability system. Our accountability system came into being about 3 years ago through state statute, and that state statute allowed the State Board of Education and the Nebraska Department of Education to build a system that really is best in meeting the needs of Nebraskans and students and families and schools in Nebraska. In that process, we did stakeholder engagement at that time as we built this accountability system, and we believe our accountability system has input from across the state. Our accountability system really has two elements. One is an element of what we call raw classification, and that's some of your common metrics that you would see in an accountability system. Those metrics would include such things as test scores, growth and improvement, as well as status, graduation rate, participation, some of the traditional metrics that you would see in No Child Left Behind. But we also have what we would consider a qualitative component of our accountability system, and that's really looking at the implementation of best practices. We call that particular process our evidence-based analysis, or EBAs, and it's a combination of raw classification and the evidence-based analysis that makes us look at how we classify schools in Nebraska. We have 4 classifications of schools in Nebraska. They're excellent, great, good, and needs improvement. From our needs improvement schools, we then identify by state statute 3 schools that we identify as priority schools. Those 3 schools we're providing support and intervention to really change the trajectory of student achievement and success in those 3 schools.
Terrific. And you were just talking about schools that might be in need of improvement and mentioned earlier a focus in Nebraska on equity. Certainly nationally, some observers have expressed concern that with ESSA and the weakening of sort of federal accountability mandates, that some states may give up the push to try to improve student achievement and reduce socioeconomic and racial achievement gaps. Can you talk a little bit more about what the state's planning on doing in that area?
Certainly. And I would ensure that Nebraska will not lose sight of equity as an important part of an accountability system, but it's also an important part of our state strategic plan. So our State Board of Education, the Department of Education, just approved in December a new strategic plan, and I would say you would find elements of the importance of equity throughout that state plan. That strategic plan will be a part of our ESSA state plan, as well as our accountability system will be a part of that process. We're just underway holding additional stakeholder meetings around the state that are occurring over the past couple of weeks and will continue to occur in March, that are providing input from across the state, and equity is one of those key elements of input that we are focusing on. So equity still is a critical priority for Nebraska as we look at how do we continue to focus on improving student achievement, student success for all students in Nebraska.
Ultimately, what aspects of your state plan do you think will be most controversial inside of the state or perhaps most challenging to implement?
I would hope that we don't have controversial components of our state plan. I think by our accountability system, our strategic plan, the listening sessions, input sessions, the stakeholder engagement that occurs as a part of processes in Nebraska, first of all, I would hope that we don't have controversy as a part of that process. However, I do think we will have challenges like other states. If you look at many of our data points, you would see that we have challenges in improving student achievement in our communities that serve a high student population of poverty, a high student population of our English language learners, our Native American schools. So again, our schools that serve minority populations and serving special education students, those are all still critical elements. I don't think it will be controversial, but I think like other states, the challenges we have is to ensure that we're providing the right supports for student success for our students who are most at risk of being successful in an educational setting.
But some observers have questions whether there are adequate resources and capacity at the district level and even at the state education level in many places across the country. What's your thinking on that question or that concern?
I think that's a great question, and I think like other states, our districts across the state are challenged with the resources and the need for resources, and how do we look at resources to adequately support education. So we could have, I'm certain, a full conversation on the need to address support and resources for our schools. One of the things that we are doing, and granted it's only for 3 priority schools, but we're really learning from our process of intervention with those 3 priority schools, what are the kind of supports and intervention and strategies that really make a difference in our schools that need improvement, and how do we scale that up across the state to really continue to focus on student achievement and improvements for all students as a part of our intervention process. And it's taking a look at more than just test scores. It's looking at local boards of education. It's looking at leadership. It's looking certainly at educator effectiveness. It's looking at a host of supports that are needed. Do the school districts have the kinds of support systems to really create a foundation for success?
And are there ways in which the U.S. Department of Education can help your state with this work?
I think the sharing of best practices around the country is critical, and I think that's a critical role the Department of Education can help play. And I think those best practices need to be those that are research-based, those that we know have an impact, and know that they have an impact on addressing issues of equity. I think continuing to share those best practices is critical. I think the funding decisions that are made will be, and the budgetary priorities will be critical And as we think about those budgetary priorities, things such as early childhood, after-school programs, the kinds of strategies that we know help low-income families and children are critical to maintain and actually critical to grow. So I think, again, at the federal level, if we can pay attention to those kinds of areas such as building relevancy in education, when you think about career and technical education, that's another component of a well-rounded education. And we need to move away from this mentality of a simple test score is what we drive for, but understand that a well-rounded citizen comes from the experiences and success in a well-rounded education.
Thank you.